Hi there, viewers. Today, I'm joining in conversation with Makonnen Sankofa, the author of Life in Gambia, The Smiling Coast of Africa, and he's also the author of The Rise of Rastafari, Resistance, Redemption, and Repatriation. It's a pleasure to have Mr. Makonnen on the show. Hi there, Makonnen Sankofa.
Yes, I'm here from the beautiful smiling coast of Africa known as the Gambia. Thanks for having me on your show, Peter.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you. I'm also joining you here from Nigeria. So Makonnen, let's talk about your best-selling book, The Rise of Rastafari. How does this book come about?
So, The Rise of Rastafari, Resistance, Redemption, and Repatriation. It's a book that I initially published in May 2019, and it has been a revised edition that has come out, which came out almost 3 years since I released the first copy. So the revised edition come out in 2022. I think it's in April towards the start of May. It came out almost 3 years since I produced my original copy. The reason I originally produced The Rise of Rastafari, Resistance, Redemption, Repatriation. I wanted to dispel a lot of the misconceptions that people have about Rastafari. I find that people are very ignorant about Rastafari and what it is. And I mean, if it gets to me myself, I'm a Rastafarian, and I've been a Rasta since I've probably been about 20, 21. I'm 31 now for at least a decade. And what I find is that when you talk about Rastafari, the things that often come into people's head are, just people that have locks, people that smoke ganja, vegetarianism, Bob Marley, but people don't seem to understand or the principles of Rastafari. They can't see it beyond just kind of like a culture or a trend or So I think it was very important for people to understand what exactly Rastafari is. And Rastafari is it's a Black Power and Pan-African movement that has a spiritual nucleus. It arose about in Jamaica in the 1930s following the coronation of Emperor Haile Selassie. And the significance of that is that, at that time, all the African nations were colonized by European powers. So Ethiopia, as the only independent nation, was significant. And then you also have the fact that, the context of the environment, people in the Caribbean hadn't seen, and I say the Caribbean because this is where the movement emerged, people in the Caribbean hadn't seen an image of, a Black king before until they saw the imagery of His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie. You're talking about Africans taken from parts of places like the Gambia, like Nigeria, where you're in, Peter, and other parts along the west coast of Africa, and then taken on ships and sent to places like the Caribbean and other parts of in Americas like Brazil, like America, etc. And then being forced to work on plantations and the brutalization, and obviously there was a process of seasoning where the African identity, the language, the culture, all of these things were stripped away. So it wasn't just the physical pressures of slavery and the brutalization physically, but also the mentally and the minds of our people. So there was a very much an inferiority complex of our people that still went on even after slavery ended in the Caribbean in, I believe it was 1834, and then it was followed by some years of apprenticeship, a few years of apprenticeship afterwards. But even though slavery ended in the Caribbean, there was still an inferiority complex in the minds of our people where they've been taught things African were backwards and negatively about Africa, and things European was the golden standard, and to look towards Europe, and things white were good and things black were bad. So Rastafari really came about to connect people with the identity, in terms of saying that we should look towards Africa because it's where we came from, and reconnect with our African roots, and we should be proud that that we are African, and it's not about worshipping. When Leonard Howe was the first member of Rastafari, the first, known as the first Rasta, he was saying it's not about worshipping, the king of England anymore. It's like we've got our own king in Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, and we should look towards him, and we should look towards following on from a lot of Marcus Garvey's teachings, who we'll hear about later on. But a lot of the Rastafari, the founders and followers, a lot of them were Garveyites coming out of Marcus Garvey's organization. So it was really propagating something that Garvey was saying, that we should look towards, heading back towards repatriation to Africa, and we should see divinity within ourselves. And that was the importance of Haile Selassie, is to say that we must look at ourselves and see divinity within ourselves, world. And at a crucial time, you know what, where a lot of the imagery that we had of, you know what, divinity was external images, you know, like a white image of Christ. And it was very, very important at a particular period of time, a movement. It's still important today. Rastafari is still important, but it was very, very crucial, particularly back then. And it's contributing a lot in terms of, you know, changing the awareness of people and what people think about Africa. A lot of us wouldn't be repatriated on the continent today if it wasn't for Rastafari, right? The influence of reggae music. So a lot of people would look down and think low of Rastafari, right? But you know what, reggae music wouldn't be reggae music if it wasn't for Rastafari. And Rastafari has made many contributions to the world that is often overlooked. Even, you know, hair. I mean, I don't have locks. You don't have to be a Rasta to have locks. The first early Rastas didn't have locks. But even if I want to say the importance of locks now, because Rasta has popularized locks more than any other group of people in the world, even though locks existed pre-Rasta in terms of the ancient Egyptians and it being around. And Rasta doesn't have any exclusive rights because there's many people that have locks that are not Rasta. It's Rastafarians that have popularized that hairstyle more than anyone else in the world, where people used to say it was dreadful and look down on people with locks. And now people are glorifying it. People are proud of their African hair color. People are looking at Africa in a different way than they looked at before. In the Caribbean, you couldn't, particularly in 1930s, Jamaica, people used to tell people you're African, whatever, you know, that was just seen as something off, and people didn't want to connect to identify with Africa. So these are some of the reasons why it's important as well that, you know, what people understand Rastafari in terms of what it means in terms of identity. And what I think is important in Rastafari, and why I've written a book as well, I think a lot of Rastafarians come from more of a biblical perspective, and there is different views and different ideologies of Rastafari. So people do see it in a different way. But my viewpoint of Rastafari, and why I've looked, and it's not just my viewpoint, but there's other elders and other people that think in line with this as well, is from a non-biblical root of Rastafari. And I think that's very important because there's a lot of other books on Rastafari that have come down more from, you know what, validating Haile Selassie or validating the movement from the Bible. But people also need to understand, you know, the Rastafari is actually much more beyond the Bible and the context of why the Bible was used in the environment of colonial Jamaica.
Oh, that's great. I love your deep explanation to that, and I need to say thank you for that. Now, you know, reading through the Rise of Rastafari, it is obvious that the Rastafarian is one of those group of people that have been persecuted in Jamaica by their fellow countrymen. Now, could you tell us more about the persecution of the Rastafarians?
Yeah, so since the inception of the movement in 1930s Jamaica, Rastafarians have been heavily persecuted, and not just in Jamaica. So Jamaica, I want to start and mention it, but then I'm also going to talk about other parts of the world as well that Rastafari have been persecuted. And Rastafari is a very anti-systematic movement, and it was really about, you know, breaking away from the oppressive colonial white supremacist system that existed in Jamaica at the time. And you know what, the colonial government, they didn't want these freed Africans, you know what, or three, you know, to think differently and you know, start to do for himself and unite. So they tried to suppress the movement from the very inception. As I mentioned earlier, Leonard Howell, who's, you know, accredited being the founder of Rastafari, he went in prison. He was arrested in prison several times. He was put in prison for sedition, and they didn't like the fact that what Rastafari was bringing forth and the potential that they could see, you know, for the masses of Black people to, you know, to rise up against the system. And in terms of the persecution against Rastafari, there's been persecution for different reasons, but it's been constant since the inception, and it's been bad. So you've had reasons such as, you know what, the colonial system, you know what, wanting to suppress this Afrocentric pro-Black movement. Then you have the ganja now, something that's very important. Not every Rasta smokes ganja. Yeah, you don't have to smoke ganja to be a Rasta, but a lot of people have been persecuted for ganja, whether they smoke ganja or not. Yeah, and that was certainly in Jamaica at a time. For example, there was a lot of innocent Rastas, for example, who were taken to prison, or, you know, laws were then put in place, for example, and a lot of Rastas were persecuted for ganja, and then also a lot of Rastas who didn't smoke ganja were put in the same kind of paintbrush. So you had Rastas who went to prison that didn't, or got charges against them that wasn't even smoking ganja or didn't have possession of it. So this is another reason. Then you have, you know, a prejudice against Rastafari by people of the Christian faith, because many people in Jamaica is a Christian country, and you know, the majority of people in Jamaica are Christians, and they've had a very negative attitude towards Rastafari. And I think maybe that's part of another spirituality that's come across, and maybe they wanted to not necessarily just hold their values, but the fact is that they've been very hostile to Rastafari. I mean, one of the elders that I spoke to, he told me that when he was growing up in Jamaica, he grew up with the Christian telling the Rasta man, "You're going to burn in hell." And it was a lot of the Christians and the church that really hit out against Rastafari and put them down, and a lot of the discrimination was coming from the church or people in that kind of Christian mindset that couldn't see the light that Rastafari was trying to bring forth in terms of liberation and bringing a level of consciousness in our people. So you have the persecution in that level as well. So and then there's people that don't understand it, so misconceptions about it, which is why I read the book. So people don't understand it. They just see, oh, why you say Selassie? These people thinking that Selassie is God in this, or why are these people worshiping a man? Or not that everyone sees Selassie as God, but I'm just saying this as an example. And people just not understanding and getting what it is, and then people thinking it's like when they just see people that have lots and smoke ganja and not have any purposeful, associating that with it, yeah. Like I'm in the Gambia here, and people just look at Rastas, you have these people on the streets like bumpsters, what they call bumpsters here. People on the streets don't have purpose, but people not seeing beyond that because they don't have the knowledge or the education about what the movement is. So sometimes ignorance that has also brought that through as well. But it was in a time, it was just so heavily colonized in Jamaica that anything, anti-systematic or tackling the status quo, people's minds were just trained or sorted in a certain way. So when they look at this kind of movement, and when Howell was saying certain things, about the Queen of England and the King of England, and Black people united and doing this kind of things, it was like, whoa, look at these people there. They're saying this, that, and the other. People at that time. Now people are starting to get it and come to pass. Our consciousness has changes. But at that time, for example, what they were saying, the Rastas, it was revolutionary. And the majority of Black people were just not at that level. They were still in a colonized mindset. Yeah. So the persecution over the years of Rasta, examples of this now is that you had, as I mentioned, Leonard Howell, who went to prison several times. Well, not just Howell, you also have other founders of the Rasta movement, such as Joseph Hibbert, Robert Hines, Archibald Dunkley. They were all put in prison and went in prison for durations. You had Pinnacle. Pinnacle was the most established self-sufficient community in Jamaica between 1941 and 1958, and it housed thousands of Rastafarians, and they farmed, they were skilled workers, and these people, they had money, they banked their own money in Pinnacle, and it was a prospering community. Yeah. But Pinnacle was raided several times by the colonial government of Jamaica, who couldn't stand the fact that you had this sovereign it was like a nation within a nation thriving in colonial Jamaica. You had an incident in 1963, and that colonial government that led to the demise of Pinnacle, and through the raids. It was raided in 1958, but a lot of occupants dispersed. If not 1958, 1955, there was a big raid. If a lot of occupants that dispersed in 1955, and then a lot of the remaining ones left in 1958. But what you have in 1963 was an incident called the Coral Gardens Massacre, where the Prime Minister at the time was called Sir Alexander Bustamante. And there's an incident that happened in Montego Bay Coral Gardens involving it was basically a land dispute. And following the land dispute, a group of Rastafarians, Franklin Rudolph was shot over a dispute of a land by the police. Franklin Rudolph was a Rastafarian who was shot by the police, and he wanted to seek revenge for the fact that he was not shot by the person who he had the land dispute with. So he went to the person's petrol station with some of his associates, and they burnt down the petrol station. Later on, within the next day, 7 people were killed as a result of that, not by Franklin Rudolph, by when the police sent out their search, etc. And what then happened as a result of that? Now, bearing in mind, these actions didn't happen because he was a Rastafarian doing this, yeah, or his associates were Rastafarian. Even though he was shot by the police, his actions in revenge wasn't because of that. But the Prime Minister sent out a verdict after that to bring all Rastas in, dead or alive. Now, when he says bring him in dead or alive, it means bring him into prison, dead or alive. And then he went on to say, if the prison can't hold him, throw them in a cemetery. Yeah, that means to kill him. Yeah, if the prison can't hold him, throw them on Bogle. Bogle is a cemetery in Jamaica, and we've got eyewitness accounts. I've got recordings. I've listened to elders say this, and I've got recordings where they said that they was there in in prison in front of Bustamante getting beaten up, the government, the Prime Minister of Jamaica, and Bustamante said, if I don't kill out all the Rastas in Jamaica, God must blind me. Yeah. So this is genocide attempt. When you look at Rastas were rounded up, beaten up, they were called beds. A lot of the time when it was reported in the Jamaican Gleaner, it was referred to as bedsmen, because a lot of Rastas didn't have locks then. Some did, but some still didn't. Some of them still had, just beards, and that's how they were identified with. But many of them, and even though it was in Coral Gardens, it also other parts of the island, Rastas were also persecuted during that period. And during a period of a few days, not just the police were brutalizing Rasta, but members of the public jumped in as well. And if Rasta was, Rastas were beaten up, some of them were taken to prison, some of them were murdered, some of the families were displaced. And this kind of atrocity, and shows how much Bustamante hated, but it also shows, a lot of like the society in general, what they thought of Rastafari, because it was common for Rastas to be walking on the streets. And if they had locks on, people would take a glass bottle, cut off their locks. Yeah, Rastas couldn't walk in certain streets; they had to go in the gullies, and that led to a lot of Rastas, having to go and live up in the hills. And even before Rastas that had locks, it was like they were still persecuted. As I mentioned, how not only was he put in prison, he was also put in a mental asylum because the authorities claimed he was a madman. And these are some of the atrocities that Russ has gone through outside of Jamaica, because this is mainly concentrating on Jamaica now. But in Dominica, you had something called the dread law, which meant that if you saw a man who locks, which is what they identified was Rastafarian, not to say that all people that have locks are Rasta, but basically it was to say Rastafarian. So if you saw a Rasta man with locks, it was legal for you to shoot that person on sight. Wow. Yeah. Basically, so let's say it's illegal for you to kill a Rasta man in Dominica. Even in England, yeah, where a lot of our parents or grandparents are immigrated from the Windrush generation and came to England, yeah, from like the 1948 to the 1970s. When their children in the 70s, there was a big rise of the Rastafari popularity in England, and their own children they threw out on the streets a lot of time because they turned Rasta, because they were prejudiced against Rasta, because again the colonial mind that reigned in the people. A lot of it was some of it was to do with the fact that they were Christians and they couldn't take any other spirituality or faith out of it. But then a lot of it was just not even to do with Christianity. It was just that because they just didn't like Rastafari for all these kinds of some of the reasons I mentioned before. They just had some prejudice against Rastafari about understanding what it is. But the reality is that Rastas were thrown out, as many of the teenagers, onto the street. And this was a racist, British, Britain is still racist, but particularly back then, a very hostile racist society where you had, white people that used to attack people on the streets on a regular basis. So you're throwing out your own children into this environment. I remember speaking to a Rasta elder, and he told me that when he come to Jamaica and he told his father he was a Rasta, and he was like his dad beat him up and said that, this is what they do to Rastas in Jamaica, beat him up and threw him out of the house. Yeah. Wow. That man, he later on got arrested. I don't know for whatever reason, but he said he got arrested when he was arrested, he was put in prison and they trimmed off his hair, and he still got a part in his hair, a patch that doesn't grow back properly from the way that the police trimmed him, because they never just did no fancy trim like you go to the barber shop. It was This is just some of the persecution. There's more, but these are just some of the way that Rastas have been persecuted over the years,
Wow, that's quite terrible. When I read about the persecution of the Rastafarian, I was quite shocked with it. I was like, how would people behave this way? Now, I also want to ask you about this. Do you agree with Leonard Orwell's idea of Christianity as being a white man's doctrine to make the black subjective to them? This is one of the many facts that made me find your book, The Rise of Rastafari, quite argumentative. You bibliographically wrote from Orwell's book, The Promised Key, that the white man's doctrine, that's Christianity, has forced the black man to forsake silver and gold and seek heaven after death. Then it also goes further and say that it has brought us to live in disgrace and die in dishonor. Now, we, the black, have found out that their doctrine was only a trick and all the intention to make themselves strong. And for the black, in my opinion, I think Orwell is just a man like you and I. Do you not think that he's been, racist himself towards the right to have said that? Don't you think he has probably written that, based on his own personal prejudice? Or what do you think of the citation?
I think there's a lot of elements we're going to tackle here now. Let me racism, and you're alluding to, I think, that racism and prejudice, and then I'm going to talk about whether Christianity is a white man's doctrine. So just pull me up on that, for example, if I need to, after when I talk about racism and prejudice, in case I move on. But in terms of the latter part of what you said, in terms of I think you need to look at the context of the environment at the time. Like I've mentioned, you've read my book, The Rise of Rastafari, so you know what happened, transatlantic slavery and the colonial years. And just so the readers can get insight, if they haven't read the book, or in case they don't know, because I know you have people from all over the world. I'm just going to read something from the book, The Rise of Rastafari, Resistance, Redemption, and Repatriation, which is actually in the revised edition. I mentioned I've got a revised edition. I'm just going to read a part, which is on page 46 of that book. And this is something now which comes from Leonard Howell on The Rise of Rastafari, which is another book which I've quoted in this. Yeah. So let me just read it, and then I'm going to put into context what you said.
Okay.
On page 169 of the first Rasta, Leonard Howell and the Rise of Rastafarianism, Blade Howell stated that his father, Leonard Howell, Blade Howell is the son of Leonard Howell, hit out against the thought of white superiority and black inferiority that was common at the time. Blade said one of his, Leonard Howell's, first tenets was that the black man is as good as the white man and made his contributions to the world just as the white man had. But his philosophy was ridiculed. In the 19th century, when my father was born, the black man was always the last in line. He was almost non-human. Daddy, this is what my brother and me called him, did not like this. The black man is just as important and just as talented as the white man. In those days, such a statement was revolutionary. And the reason why I said that is because again, we're talking about the context of the time, where you're talking about a time, just like you said, that the black man was almost non-human, statement from Blade Howell. And you know what? White superiority and black inferiority was run rampant in the society. So what Leonard Howell was doing is you'll say he's a reactionary to white racism. Yeah, he's not necessarily a racist. It's like, for example, let's just say, and I think we have an issue with this as a whole. Let's say, you've done something to me, for example, and or your family or your community, and then I then get angry at you. Yeah. And then instead of dealing with you as a person who's done the wrong or the bad thing, you're then addressing me for being angry with something that you've done. Yeah. And I think this is like a similarity in terms of this situation here. Leonard Howell is talking about, let's just call it what it is. It's talking about white people and the ill treatment that white people have done towards black people. And Christianity has been used as a tool, to certainly in the context where Howell was talking about, to oppress black people. But he's talking about basically the ill treatment that has happened at the hands of black people against white people, and he's standing up, not just in this statement, but in general. He's been someone to stand up and say, and courageous, and be, look, this is wrong. The way that white people have treated black people, and I don't like white people because of these reasons. It's not like he's just saying it out of like he's got justified reasons because of the environment and the oppression put under black people at that period of time. So so I don't think we can really say that he's done it because of his own racism and his own prejudice. I think that's basically almost like turning and excusing, being a bit apologetic to white people and then putting the foot on the other on the shoe, because Leonard Howell never oppressed no white people. Leonard Howell never, his ancestors never enslaved people. So I think sometimes as a people, we take a bit of an apologetic stance, and it's like, for example, if you say you don't like something that white people do, or you don't like, and I use this because this could even go beyond color, but I'm using this as an example because I think this is the kind of it's relevant to what we're talking about. If you're saying that, I don't like the way black people have been treated by white people, for example, and I'm saying not all white people, by the way, because it's not all, but I'm saying by certain white people, yeah, and then you have a problem with that, you're then called racist. Yeah, for saying that, you don't like the treatment, and saying, this is wrong. So I think that really needs to change, and I think we have that complex with our people a lot. But going back now into Christianity and the so-called the white man's religion or doctrine, and when Howell was referring to it and looking at that quote, is the way that Christianity was passed on to people at that time was through the white man. Now, Christianity, and I want to be clear, and rudiments of Christianity, and it's not to say it didn't start, during slavery, Christianity, it didn't necessarily exist in the name of Christianity, centuries and thousands of years ago, but certainly the Bible and scripture, was predate slavery, and the origins of what scripture and Bible and things that the Bible comes from, for example, it was around for centuries, and some of the influence of the Bible, like the mythology, dates to, you can even say the laws of Mahat, the 42 laws, like where it says, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not this, and then you have the 10 commandments. But a lot of the mythology in scripture or existed in parts of Africa, before slavery, so that is not deniable. I think something Haile Selassie said that Ethiopia's got one of the oldest copies of the Bible, however, Christianity, as we know it today, and the way that it's been brought upon us, certainly during slavery, is a white man's doctrine. It's a Europeanized way. And what you often look at is when a lot of the slaves, for example, the enslaved Africans, a lot of the enslaved Africans came to the Caribbean. Christianity, they wasn't Christians when they came to the Caribbean. So just like how language, culture, and these slaves I mentioned earlier, they were seasoned to look at things a certain perspective. One of the things that the slave masters, the overseers used to keep the slaves as submissive, and that was imposed on them, was Christianity. I've been to universities where I've had a white lecturer, a university lecturer, that told me about the way that Christianity is imposed on black people by white people during slavery. So I'm not just saying it because I'm a black man that's angry about slavery or this, that, and the other, but I'm saying the way that it's being seen today in terms of how it was passed on during slavery, and because the Africans, Christianity didn't exist in Africa in the way that it exists today until the colonial years, the European colonial years. That's not to say it wasn't in certain parts of Africa and it didn't exist, but it didn't exist in the way that it exists, and it wasn't, the popularization of Christianity wasn't how we see it today. So when you look at, say, like the imagery of Christianity, say a white Jesus Christ that is often portrayed, for example, these are examples of, again, they say the way that I think Leonard Howe was alluding to, how it's a white man's doctrine and a Europeanization of Christianity, so as an example. So when you look at the fact that how Christianity was put upon black people and used to keep black people submissive, and then the imagery of this white Christ, all that I've mentioned, for example, and these are some of the reasons why Leonard Howe alluded to it, is the way how Christianity got to those people, Africans in the Caribbean. So also when you're talking about forsaking silver and gold and seeking life in heaven, something that Christianity had also taught, something that had also not Christianity had taught, but something which has always been basically put into the minds of our people, was that regardless of whatever happens on the plantation, or even after into the colonial years in Jamaica, that we'll get our reward in heaven, and don't worry now, we don't have to worry about working now because our reward is in heaven. Everyone else is seeking their reward now, whether it's white people or Asian. Christianity has been used as a tool by white people, basically, to advance themselves as a people, whether it's to help carry out their colonial conquest, not just through transatlantic slave trade, but even when you look at, say, in the Congo, as an example, when the King Leopold and they set all the atrocities in the Congo, it was the Christian missionaries that went in there first. And a lot of these colonial conquests and these invasions happened. A lot of Christian ministries, Christianity has then been put into, to induced into the minds of the people. So when you're talking about religion, or particularly Christianity, because I don't want to go too much in Islam as well, but Christianity, you're talking about something, a religion that had been used and put into a Eurocentric perspective, where we start to denigrate things African as well, and look down on things African because that are not in line with the Bible. And when most black people think about Christianity, recently now people are starting to see it a bit more like before, say, in the Afrocentric view, but certainly back then, Black people's image of God was, or image of divinity was a white man called Christ, and they couldn't see anything black in the Bible. Even though in the Bible, these places, there are places in the Bible like Ethiopia, which
Historical places in the Bible.
Yeah, which clearly state that, but the average black person at the time couldn't see, the average Christian couldn't see nothing, no connection between, what the Bible and Africa, or no connection between blackness. So this is the kind of reasons why he's saying that it's a white man's doctrine. And like I said before, it was to stop black people from, trying to rise up and resist, to say, things are wrong and we should try to do things and make things better today, now. Seek instead of our pie in the sky in centuries down the line, which may or not necessarily happen. But Christianity, when the way that Europeans have done it, they've Europeanized it in a way to suit their own benefit.
Okay. I would have loved to move more further and deeper into this question, because as you were speaking, there are some questions that came to my mind, but I just love to skip them for now because of our time. Now, I'd love to move to the next question. Another key fact in your book, The Rise of Rastafari, is the emergence of Rastafari and Leonard Orwell, who we just finished talking about. Now, without giving much information away, could you tell us about Leonard Orwell's influence on the Rastafari movement?
Yeah, well, Leonard Orwell was the pioneer for the Rasta movement. So he's known as the first Rasta. And you have Joseph Hibbert, Robert Hines, Archibald Dunkley, Leonard Howe, and then, out of the four most popular founders, of the Rastafari movement, Leonard Howe was the most prominent one, yeah, and he's the one that that popularized it the most out of them. And Leonard Howe was a visionary. In my personal opinion, should be a Jamaican national hero. He was he had a close relationship with Marcus Garvey. He was heavily influenced by Garvey's teachings of which are a lot in line in terms of unification of black people, race first, black people coming together, and black love and doing for self, just like we see other races of groups of people doing. And he strongly opposed the worship that black people had for as I said, this white image of Christ, and tried to steer black people away from Christianity. And also he was very adamant because he believed that the Christian clergies he called them thieves, and he believed that again it had been used as religion to keep black people submissive. But away from that now, and let's talk about other things about how. So even he rejected the colonial system completely, and he taught that black people shouldn't pay taxes to King George, and he really rejected the fact that black people should look up to King George as the British monarchy, and he said that black people should start looking and praise to Emperor Haile Selassie, who was a black king in Ethiopia. And how we created this concept of Haile Selassie as a god and king. Now, Haile Selassie was the emperor of Ethiopia, so he was a king, but he saw the need in a colonial environment in Jamaica for black people to have their own sense of spirituality, which is embedded in their own history, culture, and for them to see divinity within ourselves, because who you look towards as your king or your heroes or martyrs, etc., says a lot in terms of your psychology as a person. So I think one of the areas that he was saying that we shouldn't look to a white Christ, we should look at Selassie as a black and see divinity within ourselves, because if you look at, say, an image of God that isn't like you, and say like a white man and you're of another ethnicity, people are thinking all white people are godly, for example, and it really gets into your subconscious that and people started to see themselves in an inferior light. So he saw that the importance for black people to have to look at have a king or have a god in our own image, just like how white people have Eurocentrized Christianity, so they've got a white image of Christ, just like how you see in Asian people that have they've got their their own image of how they in terms of Islam, how they basically it's linked with their own kind of culture and history. But I think when we look at, say, Christianity, often it's our people don't they come into it at the expense of African history and denigrate. So not just Christianity, but religions in general. Yeah, I mean, when it's Islam or Christianity, we come into it, and a lot of times these are then we throw away with African culture, denigrate. Whereas other people, it enhances the culture. So he was saying that there was a need for us to create this movement based on our own experience, and for us to, in terms of reconnecting with Africa. Because one of the main pillars and principles of Rastafari is repatriation, and repatriation at the cornerstone of it. Marcus Garvey, he wasn't a Rasta, but the Garvey movement and is heavily about the back to Africa. Although Garvey didn't repatriate, or Howard didn't repatriate himself, but that was the intention, and it was basically to say under oppression and of racism, discrimination in the Western world, and we have a memory of Africa, and in terms of when Haile Selassie was crowned, it brought back a memory that some of us. It was to say that we can look to ourselves in a more positive light. And look to ourselves as gods, as kings and queens, instead of looking at ourselves as inferior people, as slaves and a second-class citizen, which is the way that Black people had been persecuted and treated in the Western world. So the call for repatriation is one of the, as I said before, I can't stress how important this is to the Rastafari movement. And I think even for those that are in the diaspora, I think there's always going to be something missing if you're not fully connected onto the continent. So I think really every Rastafari should at least try to go to Africa, even if they're not living there. So that is what they were striving for, and the aim of how it was the on the raising the consciousness and the minds of our people out of colonialism. Yeah, so it was to basically to rid the vestiges of our mind of colonialism and white supremacy, and for Black people to be proud of self, to look at reconnecting with our history, and to go back home. Africa is our homeland. That's the place that we were taken away from the Western world, 300, 400, 500 years ago now, and it was really about the call to rally around home, and that's something that the reason why Howell they wasn't able to get home is that they had intentions to, but there was under, as I said, so much persecution by the colonial government, and then other Rastas by their family, by this, that, and the other, and this is what stifled a lot of the Rastas from actually. Some have made it home, repatriated to Africa, like myself, but this is what stifled and stopped a lot of the early Rastas from repatriating. But this is some insight. Learn how we built Pinnacle. Pinnacle was the most self-sufficient community in Jamaica, I mentioned earlier, between 1941 and 1958, and he used to give out money to poor people that were suffering in the street. So he did a lot of what he was really a freedom fighter for the people of Jamaica, and he went into court and said, no, the King of England, he's not my king. He's like, I praise His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie. So he was an advocate, like I mentioned earlier from the quote from Blade Howe, that the Black man is just as good as the white man, and we've got a history which is just as rich and about defending, the rights of Black people in colonial Jamaica. Just a bit of an insight about, the person, Leonard Howe, the man.
Wow, I love the sound of that. Thanks for adding that to the answer. And I think I would love to take a break on Makonnen Sankofa, on Rastafari. We'll catch you up later. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.